When someone says their bourbon is made with 100% corn, you can't really believe them, can you? You can if it's our guest today. Scott Blackwell of Highwire Distilling Company wanted to create a spirit that was different. But how do you even start? I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week, we are inspired to live life one cocktail at a time by the best in the industry. Winner of the Best of the South Award from Garden & Gun magazine this year was just one of the many awards that Highwire Distilling Company has won since its decision to make bourbon with Jimmy Red, a corn that moonshiners used in the past and came very close to extinction. But it's really Scott's tale to tell, so I'll let him tell it.
So I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, up in the upstate. My wife Ann, who is the other half of this business, is from Orangeburg, South Carolina. So we're both native South Carolinians.
And so you have this award-winning distillery. Talk me through the path of how you even decided to start making bourbon and all the other things you make.
Well, first off, we did not know anything about distilling when we started this. Literally bought all the equipment, renovated this space, and got in the building, and then turned on the still and distilled our first stuff. So it was 6 months of construction and all this, and then had like literally had never distilled a thing. It was kind of a scary thing, but historically I've been kind of done that a few times. I was in the coffee business years ago, bought a roaster, didn't know anything about roasting coffee. How hard can it be? And I'm also an obsessive person, so I read a lot, watch videos, tour around, check out what people are doing, just sort of like, how you do it. It's easier these days with social media, but back in the day it was trickier. Things like roasting coffee in the early 90s, the internet wasn't really a thing. So this has actually been, there's almost too much information out there. We were brewing beer. We had a bakery, packaged food company, selling organic, place and bake cookie dough, biscuits, things like that. And on, just for a hobby, we were brewing beer. And then we were thinking about, we knew that we were going to probably sell the bakery. We were getting a lot of interest from large companies, and we had investors, and it was just sort of inevitable that we were going to end up getting out of that business. And I thought, maybe we ought to start a brewery, and kind of went on for a couple of years. And I was hauling equipment in the door and putting it in our basement, and refrigerators, and Ann's like, what is all this? I would leave on a Saturday and go to the homebrew store and come back with, $1,000 more worth of equipment. And she was like, how much did you spend? You're freaking me out. And I'm like, well, if we're going to get serious about this, we've got, there again, this is that obsessive nature.
Right. We have the perfect refrigerator, yay!
Right. And so she finally fessed up to me after I took her in a bunch of beer stores, and there were walls of beer. She's like, I don't really know that I want to do beer. Mm-hmm. That sort of scares me. There's a lot of breweries, and they all kind of have a story like ours. So how do we feel like it's late? Mm-hmm. So it was a bit of a crushing blow, but we went to hang out with a friend of ours that owns a beer distributorship, and first thing out of his mouth, he says, hey, I'd love, you guys will make great beer. I know you will. I know, and I'll buy it and distribute it for you. But have you ever thought about spirits? And I was like, it's funny you say that, because Ann said that yesterday, actually, and I'm like, I don't know anything about spirits. How do you make it? What's the deal? It just comes out of the still and it's clear. And how much really flavor can you taste from one spirit to another? I mean, how much translates through?
So obviously you were not a big spirit drinker before that.
No, and growing up in South Carolina, bars here only had mini bottles.
Oh, interesting.
So guess what? It was very limited and very more of like what I would call industrial, you know.
So Kentucky and Tennessee, what they were doing there didn't really bleed over into here?
Not really. I mean, you know, sure, the big guys, you know, Jim Beam and things of that nature, but it wasn't, you know, there wasn't a depth. And also, I believe that in this country, I always like to say that we're just now starting to recover from Prohibition, because first was wine, and when I was younger, like in the, I would say in the late 70s, early 80s, you'd go to a restaurant and you'd get a carafe of wine. You know, you know, they had jugs they were dumping in, you know, that kind of thing. And then the good stuff was imported. We didn't think we made good wine here, and you know that was sort of early. You know, the Judgment of Paris was happening, and sort of wine was starting to grumble a little bit out there in the West Coast and California. Fast forward to now, you know, wine was the first mover. Then behind that was beer. It was, you know, the big guys there again, even really in the late 80s. And when I in my restaurant, I decided I was only going to carry craft beer in 1989.
That was early. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my choices were Anchor Steam. I was going to say Sam Adams.
Was that considered still?
Pete, yeah. Like that day, it was like the most amazing, you know, thing in the world. And then you had Pete's Wicked Ale.
Right. Oh my gosh.
You know, so
I remember all that stuff too.
Yeah. So I thought that's a really cool business, and I had gone to Vermont, and there was a brewery up there called Catamount, and I just really sort of got obsessed with sort of that, like, it's not wine, but they're making things, and I think that's really cool. Then, you know, cider kind of has had a moment and continues. Then the beer started to evolve into sours and gozes, and, you know, just like wine, it got even more and more, you know, kind of splintered. So spirits are kind of the last bastion, and you know, it felt, it's just like anything like that. You know, when you're an early mover, and we're not that old, 6 years, but at that point there were only about 150 distilleries in the U.S. Now I think there's like 1,700. But there weren't a lot of guys like us that I could go and say, yeah, you can make a living doing that. So that's what really spooked me. It wasn't, you know, can we make alcohol? It was, can we make a business and like make a living off of this? I love the idea of it, you know, making anything. So,
but spirits is a big category.
Yeah.
How did you decide on what you wanted to do first?
Well, I looked at the wine business and thought, you know, there are a lot of guys out there that are doing, you know, 10 to 20,000 case businesses that have been doing it, and that's all they do, and that's all they're ever probably going to do. And their life seems pretty good. You know, they have to work and all that, but they've got a brand. They're not trying to conquer the world. So I thought, you know, this is really more of what I would call the word craft is so overused. As part of that thought process, I thought, well, what is craft in distilling? Because the big guys, you know, in Kentucky and Indiana and all that, you know, there really weren't that many. There are like 8 of them, but they make a good product. So what are we bringing to the forefront? Yeah, they make bourbon. Okay, so we make quinoa or millet whiskey. Well, there's not much of a market for that. So one thing that we learned early on with the bakery was we always got obsessed with these really cool flavors we would make. Like we made a pumpkin ginger cookie or a lemon white chocolate. But at the end of the day, chocolate chip sold the best. And there's a reason for that, you know, even, you know, so we thought we really need to be making things that people understand, like rye and bourbon and maybe a single malt gin, things of that nature. Yes, they're big categories. There's a lot of competition. But if we could introduce something that's worth doing and bring a flavor that they aren't making you know, within that category, and with craft beer, a lot more drinkers are used to experimenting around. They're not stuck with their only drink Evan Williams, period, which, you know, has been historically the way that, especially in that bourbon world, has worked. But now brown spirit drinkers, usually you go to their house and they'll have 20, 30 brown spirits on their bar, and they love tasting different things. So this was all conceptual at this point. There again, didn't really understand about the what went in, came out type thing. And our first sort of stab at it was we used an heirloom white corn, an open pollinated corn. So we thought, oh, it's heirloom. That's cool. Let's do that. It really didn't have a dynamic flavor. And
so you put it through the still, and as it came out, it was like
it was corn. It was cool to make it, but it was definitely like, is this enough?
Right.
And just because it's local, that means something locally. But in New York, people don't care that you're using local. They're like, that's quaint and that's nice, but and you're making it in small batches. Well, who cares if it doesn't taste that different?
Right.
All that stuff just that's sizzle. So, in parallel, there again, obsession, obsessive personality, panic, angst, all that sort of going on. And this is the fall of 13 when we were opening, and I'm reading and looking at trade publications, going to stores, scouring the shelves. I mean, sort of panicked, like I say. A friend of ours, John T. Edge, who runs the Southern Foodways Alliance, and I were walking across the parade deck over here at Marion Square, and he said, oh, distilling, huh? Have you ever thought about working with sorghum? And I'm like, well, I worked with it with the bakery, with gluten-free. I should try it. Mm-hmm. I'm curious. So I was like, well, I wonder what that would taste like. So we got some sorghum, mashed it, fermented it, distilled it. The fermentation was crazy. It smelled like bananas, and the distillation was amazing. And I'm like, oh, that tastes a lot different than the corn. And it was sort of like light bulb moment of like, okay, well, just like tomatoes and mushrooms and things like that, I wonder what other corns would taste like. Let's take a deeper dive. Just because it's heirloom, what does that mean? Who cares? So this all happened in about a 6-week period. Mm-hmm. We called Glenn Roberts from Anson Mills, who has really restored Charleston Gold rice. He works with a ton of different varieties of corns. He's working with chefs like Dan Barber, Chad Robertson, chefs all over the country, all over the world. This guy knows a lot about ancestral grains.
Had you worked with him before in the bakery?
No, knew him. No, we were really kind of using, unbleached flour. It wasn't. We were making cookies. We weren't making breads.
Right.
So it wasn't as critical. We were using good quality stuff. We actually used Lindley Mills out of North Carolina. Great miller. Glenn knows them well, works with them. So we sort of had this like parallel life, and Ann was on the Slow Food Board in Greenville, and he had come and done some talks and was around. I knew who he was, but it wasn't really, he was more chefy. Mm-hmm. But I said, we've got to get in touch with this guy. And he happens to be from South Carolina, or live in South Carolina. He's from California originally, but he has a place in Columbia, South Carolina, 2 hours away. And I said, Glenn, we need to learn about corn. We need to understand more about corn, because corn is the primary ingredient in bourbon, as you know. So that's the place where you start. We can talk about the wheat and rye later, but let's focus on this corn, 70% of the grain bill. Go down to Clemson at the research center and meet with him, and he's got a 6-foot table full of 50 corns, and he's going through, and he's kind of manic when he starts going. He's going through, and he's telling me this one right here, and he's using scientific terms, and
I'm passion, right?
And he's skipping around, and he keeps skipping over this one, and I said, hey, well, you didn't mention this one right here in the middle of the table. What's that one? And he goes, oh, yeah, that's Jimmy Red, James Allen Red. That's the one you want. It's an old hooch corn. That's the corn. That's the one I think you ought to grow. And I'm like, well, it took us like a half hour to get here. But I learned a lot about a lot of other corns. So I said, great, we would love to make some of that. And Glenn is, I think Glenn gets hit up a lot with a lot of people asking, for favors and things. So there was a little bit of like trust building that had to happen. And he said, you guys, distillers and brewers are grain hogs. You use a lot of grain, and our grain's special, and, you need to, be respectful of this. So he sort of gave me a little bit of a lesson at that point, and he said, but also, how much do you need? I said, well, about 1,000 pounds. He goes, well, then you're going to have to grow it. I'll give you the seed for free, but you'll have to grow it. You need to write a check to Clemson for research, and have them help you, and I'll work alongside, and we'll grow it organically. And
So you had to wait another year for it to grow.
Yeah, we had to wait
How long
about
did it
5
take?
months. Yeah.
5 months.
Yeah, but that's painful. I mean, this was
especially when you don't even know if it's going to taste good.
Right. And we wrote a big check. And so I was in the field. It went in the field in April of 14. And I was in the field running behind the tractor when the seeds went in the ground. And then I went back the next week when it was starting to germ. And then I was back. We went every week and followed it all the way through. And I kept saying, okay, when do we get to harvest? And Glenn's like, it's not dry enough. We need to get it down to 13% moisture. And it had dropped down, but we were getting tons of rain. We're in a humid environment. And you'd test it in the morning, it'd be 17%. You'd test it in the afternoon, it'd be 23, or vice versa. And it's like, we're never going to get to 13. Then it just started raining and for days, and we figured out that we couldn't get a combine in because it was so muddy. And it was only 2.5 acres, but he said, you're going to have to get some volunteers, and we're going to have to hand break this stuff. So we went in and we made a fun party out of it, and a friend of ours, a chef, cooked a bunch of grits with Jimmy Red and sausage and stuff, and cooked a big breakfast out in the field, and we fed everybody, and we got the corn out of the field in probably about an hour and a half or so by hand. But at that point, the drama goes on. We didn't have a way to clean or shell the cobs. And we also didn't have a way to mill it. We didn't own a mill at that point. So Glenn's like, all right, I'm going to take this stuff back to Columbia. We're going to hand sort it, clean it, shell it, and then I will mill it for you. But the deal is, I mill it as you use it. We can't sit around. Yeah. So he would mill it, and they would bring it down, and then the next day they would mill some more and bring it down, and it was a lot of the
I feel stressed just sitting here.
The drama was perfect, so it ended up being.
And you're like, please let it at least taste good.
Right, yeah, and so, but we were making the mash, and it's this beautiful magenta color, and we put it in the fermenter, and the next day we walk in, and there's this like 3-inch oil cap sitting on top, which we had been using other heirloom corns. We just weren't seeing that. And it also didn't smell like corn necessarily. It had more of a fruit. My wife says banana Laffy Taffy, artificial fruit, I guess. But it did have kind of a fruity fermentation going on. And we tasted some of the mash. It was getting lower in pH and sort of sour. And there again, couldn't tell a whole lot from that, but I was definitely just anxious. So we do a long fermentation. Our fermentations for distillers, it's about a week, and we use an ale top fermenting yeast. We use controlled fermenters, so they're white wine style that we can clean really well, because we also do sweet mash versus sour mash, so we don't use any backset, which is easier to get an infection in. So anyway, all of this is going on, this fermentation, so it's closed up, and I'm looking through the hole, watching it, bubble and everything. We finally pump it over a week later into the still, and it starts coming off, and we're noticing there's a viscosity to it, this heaviness to the spirit. But also we're noticing there's some like marzipan, but also like some spice flavor that we're sort of feel is really unusual. But also it doesn't taste like corn necessarily. It's not cobby or vegetal. And I'm like, whoa, this is really, this may actually be a legitimately good idea. So sort of starts to sink in, and we put it in barrels. By this point, we're starting to work with barrel entry proofs, and we've got a lot of heat here. It's ambient. We'll get up to 100 degrees back there, and 90+% humidity. So we're going into new charred American oak barrels, but we're going in at 105 and 110 into the barrel. Legal limit's 125. Reason is we don't want to over oak this stuff, and they're going to fast forward about 6 months, and we're tasting it out of the barrel, and chef friends are coming by and trying this and going, whoa, how old is this? This is unique. This has got a really unique flavor, and we're starting to get excited, but we're not going to sell any. And everybody's like, when are you going to release it? When are you going to release it? And a friend of ours was sitting here one day, a chef out of Houston, Chris Shepard, and big bourbon fanatic, and he said, he has a friend with him. He goes, try some of this, and they try it. And he goes, how old do you think that is? And he goes, I don't know, 4 years or so. And he goes, no, 14 months. And he's like, and what's the proof? 117. It had gone up, but it's super crazy. It's like 95 proof. And so he's like, this is ready right now. You should release it. And I'm like, we're not
legally we can't. Well, we can't call it bourbon.
Yeah.
It's got to be in there.
Yeah. So we decided to wait a minimum of 2 years so we could go to the straight bourbon tag, and we put it on sale that year. It would have been in 16, and I left the morning of. My wife was like, I don't know if we're going to really sell this or not. I don't know that people are really excited about it. I said, well, I've got to go to the fields. And she goes, what are you doing? What do you mean? And I said, well, we're pressing sugar cane today. We make an agricole style rum. So she's like, I can't believe you're not going to be here for the release. I was like, well, we're pressing cane. I've got to go do that, So she calls me, and the phone's kind of spotty down there, and she goes, we're out. And I'm like, what do you mean? She goes, yeah, we sold out in 11 minutes. She's like, she goes, that we had one bottle left. And she had to hide that and hold it back. But she was of course elated. And then during that period, we were also doing seed increases during those years. So we were bringing, pulling some from the field to make more whiskey, but pulling some for additional seed, and continuing to work with Clemson. So it really sort of, at first I was tempted to put wheat or rye in, because that in the bourbon world especially, the flavoring grain is considered wheat or rye, not the corn. And I'm like, well, that seems backwards, because corn's most of the grain bill. And they're like, yeah, well, most of the flavor comes from the barrel. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of flavor in the spirit. So why would, so maybe the corn is just not that, kind of remarkable. So we were sharing a house down at an event, and with Julian and Sissy Van Winkle, and of the Pappy family, so we Stitzelweller back in the day. And Julian says, tell me about this red corn you're doing. And I tell him, and he says, well, send me a bottle of the White Dog, the new make, and I'd like to try it. So we got back, I packed up a flask and sent it over, and literally 2 days later, my phone's like, I come back upstairs, my phone's laying there, and it's 2 missed calls and a text message, call me. So from Julian. So we don't chat regularly. I haven't talked to him in a year probably now. Anyway, I call him. He goes, "Hey, I just got your whiskey, and gotta say, my mind's kind of blown." He's like, "What else is what is in here? Wheat or rye?" And I said, "It's 100% corn." And he goes, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure we made it." You know. So he said, "Okay, what kind of yeast are you using? Where did you come off the still? What barrel proof are you going in? What kind of barrels are you going to use?" He starts asking me all these questions. He's like, "I got to tell you, he goes, "I swear there's wheat or rye in here." And I'm like, "I promise you there is no wheat or rye." And we leave it at that after about 15 minutes of chatting. A few weeks later, he's in Charleston and comes by the distillery. He says, "Hey, can we pull some stuff from some barrels?" And I said, "Sure." So we pull a few samples, and he tries it. He goes, "What's this, like 4 years old?" And I said, "No, it's about 12 months old." And he's like, "This stuff just drinks older." And he goes, "And he goes, "You were onto something." He's like, "I really am excited about this." He said, "I got to tell you, I've been, drinking whiskey my whole life." And he says, "Your White Dog is the best I have ever had, period." He was like, "So you grow and make a lot of that stuff." He's like, this is a good move." He has gone on since to go and be doing whiskey events, and people will call and email us and say, "Julian Van Winkle said, what whiskey should we be drinking?" And he just says yours, period. None of the others, And he's been so it's been great because it obviously is very flattering, and we need some flattery while we're being patient.
Now, you briefly mentioned rum, an agricole rum.
Yeah. So while this was going on, just out of curiosity, I was saying, okay, well, we put this sorghum in, it tastes different. We put this whatever in, and it tastes different. We grow a little bit of sugar cane here in South Carolina. Most of the guys around here make syrup with it. Well, I love rum, but rum, as you may know, as a category, is very polluted with lack of rules. Mm-hmm. So we can make a molasses-based rum, but molasses is so industrial and processed. I felt like, let's get farther back to the agriculture and do something that I've had a little bit of, but I hadn't really had a lot of, which is rum agricole. We're not in Martinique and Guadeloupe, so we can't be part of the AOC, but we can follow their rules. And what we liked is there's no coloring, no sugar, nothing added to it. Have to use raw cane juice, fresh cane juice. And you have to come off the still between 70 and 75%, and it's yeast and juice, period. So I talked one of the farmers in the mid-state into letting us pull a little bit of that juice and make a batch of rum, and it was super sulfury and funky, and I was really disappointed when we made it. And I told Ann, I said, we didn't have a lot of money, so this juice was expensive, and I thought, I've just wasted a few grand, and she's going to be disappointed in me. And so I went to her and I said, I think I've messed it up. I don't, I thought the juice tasted great, the fermentation was great, but this stuff coming off the still is really harsh. Mm-hmm. And that night I couldn't sleep, and I was reading articles on agricole, and in there was one that a place where it said they rest it for a minimum of 3 months in stainless before they release it. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. Well, now I know that sulfur blows off. So the sulfur slowly just dissipates. So she said.
So you just took it off the still, put it in 3 months later.
Put it in the still, put it in stainless, then we put it in barrels, and then we would just go back and try it occasionally, and it was like just getting better and better as it sat. And you'd think spirits don't change, but they do, especially from fruit And I believe with the cellulose and everything in sugarcane, it is very much like a brandy. That's why the French treat it like cognac. Once that was in fall of 13. So there again, we weren't sitting around, not wondering what to do. I was kind of frantically trying to figure out, get my head around distilling and sort of
what's going to work.
Yeah, what goes in, what comes out, what's the flavor, how much impact do we have? During that time, there's a guy named Dr. David Shields, who is at the University of South Carolina, and he's a food historian, and he said he had heard about some of our experiments, and he called and he said, well, I've been wondering, there is an old ad that I found in Charleston from about 200 years ago for a thing called watermelon brandy they would make from watermelons. Would you be interested in making this? And I said, well, yeah, why not? But I thought it's probably going to taste a lot like rum because it's just sugar. Well, I was wrong. So we ended up getting some of the Bradford watermelons, which were thin-skinned 40-pounders, very squashy, compared to the round, like store-bought melons. I learned a ton about melons, and there again, I was learning more about agriculture at this point because fast forward years later, we select melons now, and we'll taste 4 or 5 varieties and pick the one we're going to use. And if you taste them against a store-bought melon, they taste completely vegetal and squashy. They don't taste. You just eat it by itself. You're like, ooh, this is good watermelon. But when you taste them side by side, it's more vegetal, especially the old heirloom varieties. So we had no idea how we were going to process this. We got about 8,000 pounds of melons, and we had knives and spoons, and we scooped out the meat and pressed it by hand through these screens that we had made into muck buckets. And it took us about 13 hours. It was miserable. It was hot. It was, like July and 100 degrees, and everybody was sticky and tired, and by the end of the day, no one was talking to one another. And Ann looked at me and said, we're never doing this again. And I'm like, I was like, okay, well, I hear you. It was, I have a bit of a Tom Sawyer effect, so I'll think up things, and then that I was working, but I'm maybe not working, or I'm not in the trenches as much a lot of times. And then she'll look over at me when she is in the trenches and kind of give me the eye of this is not working out so well.
It's a good balance.
Yeah. So we made it, and people kept saying, is there rind in here? Did you put the rinds in them? Like, of course we didn't put the rind in there. But what we learned was, there's white little tentacles that go down through the melon. That's just an extension of that white part of the rind. So, and all that cellular structure, like in raspberries or whatever, that's more vegetal matter as opposed to fruit juice. So if you have a really good raspberry brandy or eau de vie, it'll smell vegetal.
Right.
And that's that cellular kind of encasement of that juice. And the same thing with watermelon. There's a lot of vegetal matter in there that kind of holds it all together. So, but it was funky. I mean, the first year we almost lost it. The fermentation was sort of brutal. We had to. We were pumping over, we were mashing down. I was treating it like wine, punching it down, and I didn't know what I was doing. But we messed with it too much, and we feel like we maybe got some little bacterial infection going on in there, minor, so it had a little funky wine thing going on. But what's hilarious is that first year of bottles is coveted if you can get your hands on one. Because it was the funkiest, and at the next year I went so sterile that I almost made it boring, and so the third year we kind of went back to.
But I love that you didn't give up. I mean, you kept at it, even though she said, "I'm never going to do this again." Well,
she came up with a better process, a better way. Leave it to her. Ingenuity, and she she came up with the idea of these big immersion blenders we borrowed from the culinary school and Cambros. So now we just meet and then immersion blend and then pour it through a big colander, and away we go. So it takes us about 3 hours to process 8,000 pounds now. And we'll get 20 volunteers in here. But we didn't make it last year. And people were really bummed that we didn't do it. But we're like, well, we've done it and we're kind of bored with it. But we took a break, and because we're in South Carolina, one of the big things we're known for is peaches. And people think Georgia is the peach state, but reality is South Carolina is the second largest peach producer behind California. So Georgia's a way distant third. And people in South Carolina are very opinionated about which peaches are the best. There is a consensus, sort of like the ridge peaches are very, kind of the favorites. So we talked a peach farmer into late season, single variety peaches. And there's a guy named Dave Wondrich who is a drinks historian. And Dave said, if you do peach brandy like you do everything else, you're going to have the holy grail of the American spirit if you do that, because no one's doing it exactly right. They're using juice, or they're using concentrate or something of that nature. And I said, well, we want to just use peaches, peel, everything. And so we ended up getting about 11,000 pounds of peaches, and I got French oak barrels because I was like, I want to do toasted French oak. I want to use something that's more European, because that would have been what they would have been using probably. I'm sure there were American Coopers at that point, but I felt, we're just dealing with a hypothesis here, and so we threw the skins and everything in, and the distillate came off, and it's very, very floral, super floral, but then you taste skin. Skin is really where the most flavor we figured out is. During that fermentation period, when I was reading some papers from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson was experimenting. All of them were with. They were all, European. They wanted to be as good as the Europeans, and so. He was a huge Francophile, as you know. So they were making peach brandy there, and there's a part of that process when you're fermenting, you get this hard cider from the peaches, and that's called Mobby. And so we got to drink some Mobby back there, so I felt like this is a historic moment. We're drinking Mobby and we're making peach brandy. And Dave said the original mint julep was made with peach brandy, not bourbon. And if you look at Jerry Thomas, a lot of his cocktails were focused on peach brandy.
Yeah.
And it was, there was an old ad where it shows the prices of peach brandy and bourbon and rye and stuff. Peach brandy is the most expensive thing. He's like, it was the coveted, it was the American cognac. So he's like, and if you will let that stuff sit for 4 to 6 years, you will have the holy grail. You will have the thing of things that everyone will want to have some of.
So when is that coming out?
About 3 years. So yeah, we don't know. We tried some the other day, and it's pretty. We have 2 barrels, and he said hang on to at least 1 barrel. So what we're going to go back at it again this year. We are going to make watermelon brandy again because we've got people that are. We don't like if. You go downstairs, you won't find any agricole or watermelon or anything on the shelves because we sell out like very quickly of those things. But we only make, 300-400 bottles a year. But it goes to New York, it goes to, wherever, and there's a secondary market for it a lot of times. So Ann actually said that she's in New York right now and said that we made some apple brandy about 4 years ago with some heirloom pippins. And she had a bottle of it up there in New York. So it's out there, but we haven't had it for 4 years.
Do you think that I can go downstairs and try some of it? What you have?
Probably not. We have some agricole, I think, down there behind the bar. There's some stuff over there that there may be some watermelon or something that Ann keeps. see where the important things are in her office. She keeps, and then we have a little library that we keep.
I'm sure
of some stuff, and I'm talking some of the good, bad, and ugly. We have some stuff that we've made that was not good along the way, and that's how you learn. So what all this comes back to is sort of what I was saying about Wendell Berry. Ann loves to use this quote around eating is an agricultural act, and she likes to add to that and expand and say drinking is an agricultural act as well. And it's true when you think about wine or beer or spirits. It's either bad agriculture or good agriculture. It's just still agriculture. And if you think of it that way, it really is kind of exciting of what the possibilities are. So we've been experimenting with other types of maize. I'm going to flip and start using the word maize because in the world we're working with now, we went to Oaxaca and Mexico City in February with some geneticists and Glenn Roberts, and we went into Texcoco where there's a maize and wheat research center. A lot of people don't realize all maize came from Mesoamerica. It all started with the Zapotecs and Mayans. And there are only 59 pure strains of corn in the world, period. And it all started there. And it all started with teosinte, which is the precursor. So we learned a lot about teosinte and these 59 varieties. We have made some whiskey with some of that as well, and I can tell you it's very, very different from variety to variety of maize. So we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface. Do I think Jimmy Red's cool? Yeah, I love it. I think it's cool. We're very focused on it. We grew 250,000 pounds of it last year. We just planted this last week. We're hoping to have somewhere around 500,000 pounds this next fall. Seed security is a huge issue for us because it is an open pollinated corn and promiscuous. So
gosh, I never would have even thought of that.
So we're working in the background on that, and that's also sort of why we wanted to go to Mexico and learn more about how it was cultivated and how they deal with it, because they're working with those ancestral strains. So I could nerd out on this all day, but I know we have limited time. Same things applying to rye. We're making a rye. Originally, we did what a lot of people do. We use some corn in there. Well, that helps with the yield and the cost. And then eventually I said, the corn's kind of messing it up. So we took the corn out. Then we were using malted and raw. I took the malted back in percentage, more raw. And then eventually I'm like, I really like the flavor of the raw stuff. So now we just use 100% raw rye. And I'm like, you get the idea here is we love highlighting the agriculture. And if you can taste that in a bottle 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years from now, and it tells a story about that, about us, about this place, and about that grain, we've done our job. And that is what a craft distillery should do, I think. That's just my opinion. It is small batch, craft, whatever. Ultimately, we're hopefully honing and developing that craft along the way. So, yeah.
Fabulous. I want to go have some bourbon.
Sounds
Should we go
good.
down there?
Yeah.
Thanks so much to Scott for letting me taste everything, except the peach brandy, which I will have to wait for like everyone else. Until then, I can make my cocktail of the week. Our cocktail of the week is the old favorite, the old-fashioned. Here's how Scott makes it. Stir 2 ounces of Jimmy Red bourbon, 0.25 ounces of Demerara simple syrup, and 5 dashes of Angostura bitters in a mixing glass. And then strain over a large ice cube. Then garnish with a lemon twist. Simple and delicious. You'll find this recipe and all the cocktails of the week at alushlifemanual.com where you'll also find all the ingredients in our shop. The non-alcoholic spirit market is getting more and more diverse, and we meet a man who has created a series of products that he says has all the spirit and none of the alcohol. Find out more next time. Anyone can buy a Lush Life t-shirt, no matter if you drink cocktails or not. There's now something for everyone at alushlifemanual.com/merch. Until next time, bottoms up. Thanks for listening to the Lush Life Podcast. For more information and links to everything you've heard, plus a whole lot more, please visit alushlifemanual.com. Always remember the wise words of Oscar Wilde. All things in moderation, including moderation. And always drink responsibly. Okay, I said that last part. Theme music is by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. Lush Life is produced by Evo Terra. And I'm your drinking partner, Susan Schwartz. I'll see you at the bar.